All right, another Sunday morning with AyAyAyAi. Today we have Cami, and very glad to have Cami because we have lots of things that we can unfold and go in multiple directions, but all not necessarily just about technology. It's the human aspect of things. It's how it is that we engage with AI, and how does AI engage with us, right? It's a feedback loop. So, uh, very glad to have Cami because we're talking about higher education. We're talking about topics that are going to take us into a next level of how it is that we educate the next generation, and how it is that previous generation, like myself, will have to change. We have to maybe unlearn a few things and learn them differently. Learn, unlearn, and relearn, right? So, Cami, thanks for joining. And this is going to be your first podcast. Am I correct? That's right. That's right. I think when you think about it, majority of the listeners here probably can agree that education didn't necessarily stop in high school or in university. Um, and majority of people that have went to high school, uh, if they didn't go to universities, it didn't stop them from education at any point. We think of education in a single frame of mind, which is that you wake up in the morning, you go to an institution, and that institution does something, something, and you come home. Education could be that you went to work, and at your work they taught you something different. Now you're educated on a topic that is not necessarily very well framed, didn't take more than an hour or 8 hours, right? Or you did it for 30 minutes a day for a long period of time. So education, I think the broad scope of it, once you are able to dissect it into pieces, you start having multiple labeling of it, right? Let's say, for example, kindergarten, right? High school, middle school, and then universities, uh, apprenticeship, job training, on-job training, so many things. Like you have a financial training, a financial education, so you can retire and learn maybe how to do sewing after you retire. So it all happens throughout your life, and it just happens in throughout so many different labels. And what has worked for us, and I'll tell you, this is the importance of why we talk about kindergarten, is that when you start in kindergarten and you learn how to learn in kindergarten, you are most likely to learn the same way for the rest of your life. You are looking for that structure. You're always falling for the pattern of what it is that you've been exposed to in kindergarten, in middle school, in high school, and let's say for a university example, right? So these patterns that we create in early stage of life is what dictates how it is that we learn by age 70 or 80. And that's one things that we are seeing over and over with the education systems that we have today is that people are learning still the same way that how they've been taught in their early life, right? Um, so, Cami, kind of walk me through your experience. How it is that has been experienced for you, because I can definitely take that and say like, well, that hasn't been the same for me because I probably went to middle school a lot before you did. Yeah, I mean, from your personal experience, like say for example, when you went to high school, right? What was that like? You know, did you have to carry a backpack full of books in it, or did you carry an iPad? What was that like for you? Right. Yeah, I mean, look, if you were to ask me, you know, when I was in say 10th grade, did I have to go to a library and pick up a book and write a book report on it? Because most likely the school had the books that I had to do a book report on, because the English teacher wouldn't say, "Go buy this book from Barnes and Nobles and read it and then write a book report on it." Right? She gave you the instructions, say, "Go get this book from the library." And by the time you pick that book up, by the time you handwrite it, right? You handwrote that report and you provided that handwriting report to the teacher. And if it was legible enough for the teacher to grade, what we are talking about here is that the process of spending hours, not necessarily learning, but the process of that learning to have an output that is that handwritten report, right? Um, it's not an overnight thing. It's a transition to say, well, that book, probably you can just look it up on your laptop because that laptop is in front of you and you don't have to walk to the library. But let me give you a whole nother sense, which is that emotional ways of identifying with things. People of that generation, like of my teacher's generation, will definitely be devastated to hear that somebody did not walk to the library and picked up a physical book and did the research on a paper and then wrote it on the paper, right? So it's an emotional attachment to the value of things that are not necessarily about education, but the way we are educated, right? How do we value how I've been educated and how my teachers have been educated, right? So there is this transition that I'm not talking about within my high school life cycle. I'm talking about the life cycle of generations, as in these educators that she's probably no longer teaching, but whoever did replace her is probably a little bit more advanced. They will say, well, you don't have to walk to the library. It's okay if you use your laptop that's in front of you and get the information, but do write handwrite it because I'm one of those teachers that is still emotionally attached to the handwriting. And if you ask an elder person about value of handwriting, they will definitely tell you the next generation will not have the value of handwriting, but they will call it a loss because they've valued it so much and they've gained and so much benefits from those values, right? Um, so I look at the next generation. I feel their pain because it's always that previous generation and their value. That's what's being installed in the next generation, and the next generation have to confront it, given the technology and the value doesn't add up, right? There's a gap between technology and the values. Um, I bet you have a whole lot to say because you're probably feeling the same pain. Yeah, I think. Look, I want to talk about something that I mentioned already about, you have this technology, but the value that we hold as humans, it clashes with that value, right? It's not necessarily a war, it's more of a discomfort, right? Excuse me, let me use the word not comfortable, right? I don't know what it means to be discomfortable or uncomfortable. It's just that you're not comfortable, right? Being not comfortable means that you're not comfortable even just 1 degree, right? Uncomfortable means that you can be like really uncomfortable with it. I don't know how uncomfortable you are, but you're just not starting at that 0 point where you can work up to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of comfort level, right? So let's start there, right? And that's important to understand these sort of distinctions because if you look at it from 30,000 feet view, the satellite view, every organization is experiencing just that, right? They see that their leadership is pulling a string for one direction, and the audience or the followers of the organization, they're not necessarily understanding why that string is being pulled that way, right? Because the leadership has a value where rest of the organization are seeing technology and they're saying, our technology and our value is not lining up with what the leadership is pulling for. And that's happening worldwide. That's happening not just in organization where they're making billions of dollars or military or even government. I'm talking about everywhere, right? This is happening because leadership is most likely, and let's make it clear, it's not about the generation or the legacy generation. It's more of like the age gap, right? How we've been taught. So there are CEOs out there that are 30 years old and they've hired some 60-year-olds to work for them, right? Because we see that in Silicon Valley where the CEOs are around 25 years old. They've been running an organization since they were 17, right? So we're seeing some of that, but it all goes back to the same that value that is being pulled, technology is pushing back, saying we don't do that, right? So say for example, an employee who's about to retire and the 30-year-old CEO that's telling him what to do, he's looking at it like, well, my technology and my value is nowhere near technology and values that you have. So what am I trying to get at from this satellite view? What I'm trying to get at is that this is a global scenario. This is a societal problem. But when you incorporate AI and machine learning into it, you really have to start thinking about how much the technology had leaps and bounds to it and how it is that everybody will react to any ideas that you put out, right? But think about it like this: your end goal and not working from that end goal versus previous goal, which was that I got mine, Jack, right? I got my high school graduation. I did my university graduation. Now you have to do the same, and you just have to follow what I did, right? That's the previous generation's goal. But there is no end goal actually stated in any of those things that we're talking about, right? So let me clarify a little bit more. Military has a mission statement. The mission statement says, this is why we exist and this is what we will end up accomplishing and this is what's going to happen. That's an end goal, right? But think about it. Even in military, the guy who wrote that mission statement, he's thinking of technology from his comfort level and from his value perspective. And then the rest of the organizations looking at the mission statement saying, well, that mission statement is driving us forward so much, yet we are using the older technology to drive us forward. Like, I have a question about that. This technology and values are not adding up. So, what we have to do for education, we really have to give that end mission goal, right? Because if you think about it, what you said is content and context, right? You're talking about teacher in a book report wants you to memorize a content and deliver content on top of that content, right? If the teacher said, I really want you to give me the context, not the content in the book report, that's the end goal that changes the perspective dramatically, right? Teacher doesn't care about content anymore. Teachers are looking at it like, did you learn the philosophy behind this book? Did you learn the societal value behind this book? But also, did you learn something that otherwise you wouldn't have learned if you just read the book and give a book report? That's the mission statement. And the mission statement, how you accomplish it, it's not up to me, but I really want you to accomplish something and I want you to articulate that accomplishment, right? And I think before we got into the conversation, we talked about how universities are sort of working towards this learning system where it's a learning culture of context. learning culture of learning together and learning from each other, right? If you don't have that today and you don't want to develop one for the future, well, I guess the fear of missing out will be that somebody else will, and whoever does it, they will see a far better cohesiveness between the people that go through the same school system versus schools that don't. And I can guarantee you, we are seeing some of that right now in our political environment, our geopolitical situation, where we're seeing some people are coming together a lot faster and a lot better, are staying cohesive, rather than to say, they're kind of like are speaking individually, right? And I think you mentioned the Zoom babies. You talk about, oh, Zoom babies are going to learn things individually. They might, and that's not the biggest concern. Concern is that when you are side by side with people and you're still an individual, where that individual doesn't relate to the person that's sitting next to them. How do you teach a Zoom baby to be relatable to the person wherever they go, right? Zoom babies are not going to be impacted negatively because they're not going to school. It's just that the school that doesn't teach all these ways of context visualization, context understanding, and understanding each other's context, right? You can still do that on Zoom. So the problem is when you learn it with a school full of like 800 students and nobody cares about context, all they care about is content, we're going to have those negative outcomes. Yeah, I mean, you're seeing it today where in a corporate environment, people are expected to work together. Where in schools, we've been taught to not work together and just take your quiz and study and take your test and don't cheat and don't let somebody else cheat off of you. Um, it's a gap because a lot of the people going back to what we said, like you go to university, you thought your education was done, but no, you go to your first job and they're totally re-educating you on how to think and how to do things. We've done that in military where we've been taught one specific topic for 6 months in a military school, and all of a sudden we've been assigned wherever it is that is we've been assigned. They taught us completely different about everything that we've been learning for the last 6 months. They said none of those things applies here, right? So it's about the learning, not necessarily what it is that you learned, right? Can you unlearn? Do you know how to unlearn? Do you know how to relearn, right? Because if you learn, somebody can teach you how to learn, but can somebody teach you how to unlearn? And we know that because we're living longer and longer today, that we don't die at age 30 like we did back in 300 years ago, right? Like we are living longer. So by the time we've been to school and we graduate from school, we live 40, 50 years past that. But nobody in our first 20 years of life has taught us to say, relearn, right? Did you learn that tobacco is a great product to smoke throughout the day? Can you unlearn the fact that tobacco is no longer safe, right? We've confirmed it. The cigarette smoking is not the greatest things for your health. People die, right? So can you unlearn that? No, I mean that's not what we've been taught. We've been taught to learn. We've been taught to learn content, right? So when you're talking about in a corporate environment, what's holding them back is that if you have to learn a topic over 8 hours a day for the next 3 months, we'll call it whatever semester, but in high school it's different, and you have to learn 8 different subjects throughout the day, and you go to a corporate environment and you have to learn Now in a corporate environment, we're learning differently. And all of a sudden it bothers us that we have to learn everything within an hour because employees are not willing to pay, for us to go back to school again for 8 hours a day, 3 months at a time, so on and so forth. So everything has to be on the fly, right? Sort of that on-job training environment. So if we have these sort of problems today, how are we going to deal with these problems in the future, right? It's going to be far more nauseous to think about the fact that, well, I'm an engineer, but I really have to relearn how to re-engineer because engineering these days, and I'll specifically talk about engineering because that's a very technical subject, is because you know certain things, but because technology is being engineered somewhere else and is being engineered for to be an average. Okay, let me pause here a little bit and talk about something engineering. Engineering, when they start on a different, on a brand new topic, they go for highest level of engineering you can think of, right? And it all comes to crashing halt just to come back down to average because they push the boundaries of engineering up to a point and all of a sudden they realize this is not sustainable, scalable, or financially justifiable. So what they end up doing, they start doing these things averagely, which means that it's scalable, it's sustainable, and it costs very little, right? So what that means for engineers is that they have to continuously learn and relearn because these engineers that knows how to do the sophisticated method of whatever that excelling topic is, now all of a sudden they have to learn it how to do it averagely, cheapishly, with the least amount of ingredients possible and the cheapest ingredient possible, right? Now they have to learn and relearn for that. So it's a resistance to say, well, I am a superior engineer in superior product. Why am I involved in an average? Well, the superior product, there's only one of them. Everything else is average. So if you look at the product market today, you will see one superior product and everything else kind of falls into average. And I'm not going to name no name, but I think you can kind of guess what I'm talking about, right? It happens in all products. So relearning and learning has become an issue today, and it's just going to get far, far more intense as we go through AI and machine learning. Because if you think about how it is that somebody can be a subject matter expert overnight, is because if you spend last 24 hours on ChatGPT and you can really put context of your previous experience to the latest context to say, wow, look, just like those contexts I've learned, I'm learning new context. But somebody who's a content learner will say, well, I cannot unlearn a content because contents that are blocked in my brain, it doesn't necessarily have these, well, let's just get a little bit more technical here. Our brain doesn't do content very well. It forgets content very, very fast. Context, on the other hand, it can fire up context and context to level that a single context learned for a few many hours or few many days, we will have that learning for the rest of our life because in the neuron environment, the neuron that fires together wires together, right? So if you take that and you're trying to say, okay, what does it mean to have context? Well, if you have a content and you understand the context of it, and you reply that context of that content over and over, your neurons in your brain actually starts molding together to fire up every time it has to learn a new context about a new content. Because this context are already trained to learn that content. So for an engineer, well, they know the basics of engineering for a very long time. So for them to learn something new based on context, they can learn it much faster versus an engineer who's been learning through a content process, as in it knows a block of things, but the brain never really fired to learn everything about it. It just learned one content about all the contents available, right? So with AI machine learning, I think it's going to be like, that the differentiator will very much prove itself, right? Prove itself to say like, who's the content learner and who's the context learner. And if there's a context learner, they're going to be able to learn 24 different topics in the next 24 hours and then be a subject matter expert, let's say in 24 months, right? Because going back to the same thing again about the context is 10,000 hour learning, right? That 10,000 hour learning is such a debated topic. A lot of people believe in it, a lot of people don't, but some people apply it and some people don't. But whatever the case is with ChatGPT, we're not going to have 10,000 hours of whatever that is. We're going to have, in my funny opinion, it's about 10 hours, right? Can you go out and do something and learn from ChatGPT and go do it again and do it 10 times? In 10 hours, I think you can learn new things and be say, you know what? I know enough about this context of this single topic that I can learn many things around this topic, right? Um, so let me pause it right there. Does that sound about something that you heard before? That's right. Yeah, I think if you think about that, learn, unlearn, and relearn. What if me and you are sitting in a room and there's 30 other people, and all 30 of them said, "Asif, content and context is not the right way to label it." I can guarantee you there'll be 30 different people telling me that we all studied it in the same way. The way you describe content and context in educational field is with these terminologies, right? And as you can tell, my terminologies are very vague. My terminologies are not necessarily what's supported in the academic field. But the point is, I will be able to learn because what we're talking about is the same thing. It's just that we're labeling it different. We all have identified the same problem. We all have identified the same context here. It's just that I have to relearn how to label it differently for purposes of academia, right? Purposes of industry could be different. Purposes of media could be different. If you go in front of CNN and you want to talk to the CNN audience, you don't want to talk about content and context. You just want to call it, I guess I have to figure out that word for it. But the point is, you have identified the same object, but you have labeled it differently. And we do that so much. We do that so frequently. But do we all can we all come to an agreement that I just labeled it differently, but you get my point, right? And that today is something that is very difficult for people to come together in. And we're talking about the same topic here, but because we don't understand how learning works, how unlearning works, how relearning works, and we don't understand each other, right? We don't understand each other because that's important. Because you understand context and I understand content, I look at you like I'm lost or you're lost, right? And you're looking at me like we're both lost, because you understand context. You don't care about the content because that's the environment that you grew up in. And if you look at the researchers, recent researchers, they talk about the fact that there's this book about learning where it talks about the fact that some people learn like they're in a motorbike, right? Same sort of content could be learned by another person, but they're going to learn it through walking in the forest in a hiking mode. They're going to hike and they're going to walk slowly. And they're going to stop a lot and they're going to say, wow, look at that, right? Somebody will say, I'm in a motorbike. I'm just going to breeze right through it. They're both learning the same topic. It's just that they have two different types of brain, right? And those two different types of brain is something that is not necessarily content and context based. It's just the way they learn, right? The way they prefer to learn, the way they are used to learning. I think when you start talking about the fact that they both have to relearn, is the challenge, right? Like, how do you teach somebody to relearn? Because the neuron that fires together wires together. How does that neuron fire together so that way it can say it's like, you know what, I'm more curious rather than being confirmed, right? Rather than something that is to say like, I can live without that. Uh, sorry, let me not use that word. Let me not use the terminology. It's more like if you're curious, you will learn the context again, right? Versus if you're so dead sure that you're not curious, um, you're not going to be really willing to relearn, right? And not relearning causes a whole lot of problem because in the AI machine learning society where things have to move so much faster, things that are done completely different. How does a teacher that says, I am so sure that every way I've been teaching for the last 20 years is the only way to teach, right? But here we are talking about what's the end goal? What's the end goal of a teacher is that teacher has to give you a score and the state has to approve it and federal government has to give you the funding because you did the right thing. Whereas in the student's end goal is that I don't know what teacher's end goal is. My end goal is to be cool kid. My end goal is to just get out of the school and just move on with my life. Right? The two different mission outcome here, right? If you think about it, neither one of them is lifelong learner. They're not understanding how to prepare for the next level of unlearning and relearn. They're just learned and they're learning still. They haven't figured out how to unlearn, right? So if you give a student a text to say, look, this is your mission from now on. I want you to understand history from the perspective of everything, not necessarily the dates and time of the year for their history. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's the way I've been quizzed in history courses, and that's how I've learned history. But because I learned history on my own, it made a whole lot of difference because I didn't care about dates anymore in the later life. What I did is I unlearned on my own about what I've been taught, right? And that's sort of that the difficulty, the dilemma that corporations will have with their employees, and the next generation, of course, will have once the Zoomies, right? Zoom generation graduates from school. They're going to see a lot of these, and they're going to see a huge gap between the people that leads them in an organization or military or whatever the government. You'll see a huge gap between them and people that are leading them, right? It's always been a problem, but it's just that gap is getting wider, and that gap is getting wider because of AI, right? So for me, when I had to learn history, I relearned it based on say geospatial data, geography, rather than the people and the culture and all the other things, right? So let's say, for example, in history class, what they taught us is that these are the dates you have to know, because I had to teach you that. Because if you pass it, that means I did a good job. That means I get my bonus and I get my salary and I get to keep teaching next year without getting fired. Whereas in the student like me who said, well, I don't really care about Ferdinand. I know he got shot one time. How many times did he get shot is what's going to be in the quiz, and that's how I'm going to pass. You know, they're not asking about why did Ferdinand get shot or why did this guy get shot. What happened, right? They're not asking the full context because, first of all, that's just not the learning culture that we ever had. But the learning culture that we need for the future will require the fact that can you learn from somebody else? Can you learn the same topic from multiple different perspectives? Can you learn from Asif about geospatial information, the resources, and completely neglect the people that's spending on the geography, right? Because if you look at the resource, you get a full different perspective of why the people behave the way they do, right? People that come from the mountainous area of the world versus people that live next to the ocean or the river, they have two different outcomes in life, right? History will talk about them differently. The winners and losers will say like, oh, they got in a war, two people got in a war. Well, yeah, they did, but have you looked at the geography of that area where they came from? Do you see that how expense like the context goes, right? You have to really look at it from many perspectives. Can we teach the kids how to do that, right? So like, okay, what are you interested in? You're interested in rocks? Can you teach me about rock and history? How did rock impact the history, right? I would be if I was teaching, right? I'd be really interested in doing that because I would like to learn, right? And somebody who's very interested in rocks, they will say, yeah. Can you think about why dinosaurs are important in geography of recent wars? I bet I can. I can tell you. I can link it somehow, right? So I guess I'm going on and on about this because like With AI, you can do this in an hour. In ChatGPT, you can type in rock and history of South America, right? What happened to these nations that got invaded by another country? What happened? Why was the fossil so important for going into the war, right? Fossil fuel. It's important because you're learning from two different. It's the same country in South America, but you're learning from two different perspectives, right? Why some country never got invaded? Nobody cared, right? It was because of the geography and the resources that country had, right? So like if you're learning it from this perspective, can you do this in an hour and a half? I mean, if you tell me if I was in high school and somebody told me to do this context-based learning, it probably will take me a few weeks because that's how much time I'll have to go through the research. But with ChatGPT, I think it's going to be done as you're speaking it. People can start writing there like, "Oh, I come to ChatGPT, blah blah blah." You know, um, that's a different way of learning. But I think the goal is to say, how do you learn and unlearn? How do you relearn? Right? Dash, dash. Yeah, at this point, I think it's worth discussing smart AI community, right? And that's how me and you got to talk a lot more frequently about what it is that you're interested in, what it is that you've been involved in, and you got to learn about what it is that I've been involved in, right? Smart AI community, if you recall, when we were talking about smart AI community, and we are saying like, what's the value? What value does smart AI community bring to anybody, right? Our process was to understand how it is that somebody learns, and how it is that from their learning I can learn, or everybody else can learn. Because as you can tell, because you've learned, somebody else is saying, well, if there's a value to be had, I will listen to her, but not necessarily I will learn everything she has learned because I know what I know. But if I need to know something more of what you know, I'll reach out to you and then we'll have longer discussion, right? Think about that as an example of what learning looks like in the future. So, I've seen this a few years ago where I think they were like less than 10 years old. They were given a task to say, how do you shoot this rocket into the space? Specifically carrying people inside the rocket, right? So we're talking about space traveling, and these are under 10-year-old kids that were given a project, and you can hear them brainstorming, delegating, and discussing the topic from such details that as an adult, I said, I don't want to denigrate myself, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure at age 10, I wasn't thinking about diesels and gasolines differently. I just call them gas, period. Right. And this child, don't call them child, I guess, they call them smart geniuses. They were able to talk about different types of, gas people will need in order to get to space. Right. As an adult, I still don't know how to distinguish between kerosenes and diesels. Right. So here we are speaking to this generation that knows far more details than I've ever been dealt with. But here I am, I'm trying to limit them to say, as a superintendent of the school, I really care that you just know this much and go with this much, right? So I'm in charge of your neurons firing together. That's going to wire together for the rest of your life. But here's what I'm going to fire them for, and they are sticking to this firing only. And rest of it is up to you after you leave this high school. I'm in charge, but I'm in charge of the most precious first 20 years of your life. Not single superintendent, but get my point here is that these are the individuals that are in charge of our first 20 years of our life. So I want to kind of talk about smart AI because in smart AI we want to be able to bring in any specialist from any sort of background, but specifically their domain knowledge. We want to be able to bring their domain knowledge in and say, you remember the blast radius, right? We talked about there's a human brain and there's an AI outside of it, and that AI lives inside of a device, and that device is powered by a data center, and that data center is powered by an electric grid, and that electric grid is powered by the water that's outside of the electric grid. That's the blast radius, right? How many people knows about electric grid? I still haven't met anybody that I can say, wow, I would like to hang out with you and learn about electric grid. But that opened up the possibility, right? Now you hear about a topic, you said like, I really want to figure out the connection between water and electric grid. Because without water, I wouldn't have the electric grid. That's insane, right? What are the connections on all these things? And if your brain was the last piece of recipient through an AI, through a device, and through the water system, how does that brain react? How does that brain feel like it can fully function, be fully involved, right? So there's a need to learn these because as a SMART, the specialist, you're learning a method of that blast radius of information. But within those blast radius, you have to put a methods together to say, as a specialist, this is the method that I would, you know, um, uh, uh, learn through. And if I learn through it, the best way to learn is to advocate. So it's kind of going back to that kindergarten and that Astronova school where they were talking about shooting up rockets into space. One person was advocating for safe travel. The other person was just worried about how the rocket will go boom, right? As long as it leaves the Earth space, we're good. But the other person has to advocate for the fact that, hey, the person inside of that cannot go boom. It has to go beyond the space and stay not boom. Right? This is me talking like an ignorant adult, right? I don't know the correct terminologies here. So the advocacy comes from research and training. So your research and training, like Cami, you researched some topics and you presented it, and somebody else learned from your experience from your research and training. So you advocated, you learned through a method, you're a specialist of a specific genre or specific topic, domain knowledge. How do you do your research and training is far different than everybody else, but everybody can learn what methods you have used, right? And everybody can say, well, you're the domain knowledge subject matter experts on these three things, and this is what you specialize on, and this is what you advocate for, right? So I think the Smart AI community, Dr. Destiny Preet did an amazing job of, putting this group together, and we are learning from each other. And that's the environment that I would say we should have more of. Because one of the things that I've realized about the the school system about the rockets and kids under 10 learning about how to shoot a rocket. Um, they were talking about not even teaching math or English. That's how much of a risk takers these guys are. They're like, well, you can learn English whenever you want. But in your first 10 years of your life, how can I get you to be something that otherwise you wouldn't get the chance to be, right? So this is a need that we actually have to identify that this first 10 years of our life, first 20 years of our lives, what we do now will matter no matter what chat GPT, what AI we have. Um, I think there's a whole lot to talk about, but let me pause here and hear your thoughts on these. Yes, and of course we are moving with Smart AI community to the workforce development, which we started with the workforce development. We just called them IO psychologists, but now we are literally driving our effort with the workforce development title holders to say how do we educate the workforce development managers, the workforce development officers, and so that way they can educate the rest of the workforce. Because in Smart AI community, I think when we speak, people feel less intimidated. I think that's a huge asset in learning environment that people will feel they are able to learn and they can learn comfortably. Being uncomfortable is not something that we want to start off with, right? You get uncomfortable because you're comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think that's what Smart AI sort of enables that say like, okay, this is how you get uncomfortable. Sort of like this is how you relearn. This is how you unlearn. You really have to be taught many things in order to do many things, right? And I'll tell you from my military background, uh, we've been taught a few things, but we've been taught not to be comfortable. And that's true because everything we've learned in an uncomfortable environment. And to be comfortable, especially in my career field, it was it was not a good thing. Like it literally felt like something was not working because you're so comfortable. And it was important because we are dealing with people's lives. We're dealing with people's safety, people's ability to carry on with what they need to carry on. So when we're talking about advocating for others, we really need them to advocate for something so that way we know what it is that we're doing adds value to what they're doing and what they're doing adds value to everything else. So there's that chain reaction. But within the smart AI community, I think that's a sort of environment that we create without even knowing it, right? Because I've pushed you guys to do certain things. I think I love that Bessie went from not knowing digital twin to all of a sudden talking about digital twin. I thought that was the greatest example of what smart AI community can do because it opens up the method, and then the method is not necessarily a 4 year college degree. It's a method of just go research. But when you research these topics, and all of a sudden you're researching the topic like, oh wait, that makes more sense now than it did before. And every time I research, I learn something new. And that's the kind of environments that we've created where people don't feel uncomfortable anymore. People just feel comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? So um, I know we spent a good amount of time on education and smart AI community, but let's talk about you, right? Like where it is that you are right now, and where it is that you're looking to get to, because I bet a lot of things are happening in your life, and maybe we'll put it here and follow up with it as the time goes. Fun phase of life. And I'll tell you, if I knew anything about machine learning at your age, which I didn't, because I went to the military and I pretty much did military until I was 28. But at one point in the military, I realized the value of AI, which was through my drone operations and through these manual labors that we had to do. And I said, well, why don't we have AI? And one of the questions that, first AI enthusiasts will find out is that it's a such a broad topic. Where you land doesn't matter. It's what you stick with is what matters. So you will land in many places, but where is that you stick and settle matters probably in the long term, right? So, but of course, uh, starting from where I started and ended up where I'm ending up at, I still don't know. Right? I still don't know because I've worked with the data ETL side of things, data analytics. So, when you do data in that level, I call myself the coal miner. We're always under the tunnel, digging up coals, digging up data that nobody knows exist. People that are not necessarily seeing how those data are coming to be, but they see it up on the surface and they're like, wow, coal generates great amount of electricity. So it's a rewarding achievement to be in the data world, but this is not where I ended up. This is not where I thought AI was. I didn't know AI and data was so interlinked. I just thought AI was AI because some magic happened. But over time, I came to realize, okay, these are the data things that we do, and this is how data works. So it's a very wide spectrum, but it all always comes down to you know where do you land and where do you keep landing at, and then finally find a place where you say like, I know everything, but this is all I want to know from now on. you know. So, Kemi, I'm looking forward to our discussion going forward, and have a good Sunday. And until the next episode of AyAyAyAi, have a good week. Take care.